Welcome, everybody. I am Mark Rozelle, Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in the United States. And this is the fourth and final in our series of webinars on the United States presidential elections 2020. Today, we're going to be talking about prospects for the 2020 US elections and their implications. After three seminars that analyzed the state of the presidential race and the foreign policy agendas of the two presidential contenders, today we take a look more broadly at the current state of play in the election, now looking quite different from when we began this series about a month ago, and how lessons from past campaigns might inform what is to happen this year, and finally, the implications of a Trump re-election or a Joe Biden win. For today's seminar, we have two presenters and two discussants. I will quickly introduce the presenters, and then they will make their presentations, and we will follow with comments from the discussants and group conversation. Professor Bill Schneider is professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government, George Mason University. He was Cable News Network's, CNN, senior political analyst from 1990 until 2009. He has been a visiting professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, Boston College, and Brandeis University. He is the author recently of the book Standoff: How America Became Ungovernable, published by Simon & Schuster. Schneider has covered every US presidential and midterm election since 1976 for the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic Monthly, CNN, Al Jazeera English as well. He has been labeled the nation's election meister by the Washington Times and the Aristotle of American politics by the Boston Globe. Campaigns and Elections magazine called him the most consistently intelligent analyst on television. He was a member of the CNN political team that won an Emmy Award for its 2006 election coverage and a Peabody for its 2008 coverage. He received his bachelor's degree from Brandeis University, his PhD in political science from Harvard. Professor Yongkun Seo is professor in the Department of Political Science at Pyongyang University. He teaches American politics, US foreign policy, and party politics. Previously, he was an assistant professor in the Department of Public and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He is a Fulbright Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and president of the Korean Association of American Politics. He has published numerous articles in leading peer-reviewed professional journals. He received his PhD and MA in government from the University of Texas, Austin, and bachelor's degree in political science from Seoul National University. Our two discussants, Dr. Sung-Jin Yo is a professor of Scranton Honors Program, UHA Women's University. Dr. Yu is an expert in the field of political behavior, political party systems, and public opinion. Dr. Yu received the PhD from the Department of Political Science, State University of New York at Stony Brook. His research is published also in a variety of leading professional journals, including the Journal of Politics and the Korean Political Science Review. Dr. So-Young Kwon is an assistant professor of global affairs at George Mason University's Korea campus and director of its Center for Security Policy Studies. She received her PhD and MPhil in social and political sciences from the University of Cambridge, an undergraduate degree in political science and diplomacy from UHA Women's University. She taught and conducted her research as a research associate fellow at the East Asia Institute of the University of Cambridge and as a Shorenstein Fellow at the Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. Dr. Kwon served as a Korea specialist and advisor on EU-Korea relations at the European Parliament and an advisor at an international sports organization. She is currently a research associate fellow at the Institute for North Korea Studies of Yonsei University and a member of the International Relations Committee of the International Sports Relations Foundation. Her main areas of interest are comparative politics, inter-Korea relations, North Korean politics, conflict analysis and resolution, and public diplomacy through sports. So those are our presenters and discussants, and I will ask Professor Bill Schneider to open with his brief presentation. Dr. Schneider?
Okay, thank you very much. I can tell you that right now, it's hard to see how Donald Trump gets reelected. He has never gotten over 50% job approval, which is usually the mark where a president can rely on reelection. And in fact, 80% of Americans right now say things in the United States are out of control. Never a good sign for an incumbent president. As you probably know, we are facing in the United States 3 simultaneous crises. We have the coronavirus pandemic, and when Americans are asked whether they approve or disapprove of the way President Trump is handling the pandemic, 54% disapprove of Trump's handling of the pandemic. We have an outbreak of racial protests, Black Lives Matter. 57% disapprove of the way President Trump is handling that issue. And finally, his strongest issue, historically, has been the economy. We had a very powerful economy a year ago. It's still his strongest suit, but it's declined also. Now it's just 51% of the American public, 51% disapprove now of President Trump's handling of the economy. His job approval rating overall, do you approve or disapprove of the way the president is handling his job, has dropped below 40%, which means it's dangerously low. Of course, the election is 4.5 months away. That's an eternity in politics. Things can change very rapidly. Look how much they've changed since January, the last 4.5 months. Things are totally different now from what they were in January. I think President Trump's biggest problem is that he deliberately divides the country. That's how he governs. Every issue, everything is us versus them. He governs exclusively for the benefit of what he calls his base. What's a base? A politician, a member of Congress, once answered that question, I thought, in a very concise way. He said, your base is the people who are with you when you're wrong. Every politician has to have a base. Sooner or later, you're going to be wrong. That's just true in politics and business and everything else. Who's going to be for you when you're wrong, when you make a terrible mistake? Ronald Reagan had people who supported him in Iran-Contra. Bill Clinton's base was pretty secure when he was facing impeachment. Every politician has to have a base, and Trump certainly does have one. It may be as much as a third of the electorate. It's not a majority. But your base are the people who are with you when you're wrong. Now, President Trump is confident that his base will save him, just as they did in 2016. And in fact, he's running for re-election using the same script that he used in 2016, the same strategy, which is that his base will be solid and that it will pay off for him in the crucial battleground states. Now, how do you define his base sociologically? It's very simple. President Trump, is strongest among white working class men. In surveys, that's usually measured as white men who do not have a college degree. That's the core of his base, along with an overlapping constituency, which is white evangelical voters. And they are important in a lot of these swing battleground states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and of course, Florida. A lot of people ask me, from time to time actually, how did Trump win in 2016? How can he do that again? Well, I got a clue of how he won before the 2016 election when I was in various parts of the country for CNN. And I did a focus group when I was in Arizona, which is now a swing state. In the focus group, I had a group of Democrats. There are Democrats in Arizona, and they're growing in number. And I had a group of Democrats, and I asked them how they were going to vote. None of them said they would vote for Trump. They were afraid of Trump. They didn't like him. And they said they would never vote for Trump. And I asked them about Hillary Clinton, his Democratic opponent. And they all said the same thing. They said they didn't really like her. They didn't really trust her. And they didn't want to vote for her to be president. And then they added something. They all mentioned a figure which had been broadcast widely on the news and got a lot of attention. You can still find it on the internet. I found it last night. It's still there. If you go to Google and Google New York Times election projection 2016, you'll find a big headline that says 85% chance Clinton wins. That was widely publicized, and in fact, these people in Tucson, Arizona, who none of whom read the New York Times, they had all heard the same figure. 85% chance Clinton wins. The election is over. What did they conclude from that? They all said the same thing. She doesn't need my vote. That was their remark about Hillary Clinton. I'm reluctant to vote for her. I don't like her. I don't trust her. And she doesn't need my vote. My feeling is Democrats could be optimistic. They are optimistic about this year's election because they don't want to make the same mistake again. A lot of them didn't vote, or they voted for Jill Stein, who was a third-party candidate. But they learned, I think, in 2016 that every vote counts, and these election projections don't always mean a great deal. Trump takes advantage of the division of the country. I wrote a book about it, lots of big books written about it. I should point out to you that the division between Democrats and Republicans, between left and right, it didn't really start with Donald Trump. It goes back at least 50 years before Donald Trump, to at least Richard Nixon. But Trump knew, he knows the division, and he exploits it and actually makes it worse, which is why the country has been more divided under Trump. It was, of course, divided under Clinton, divided under Bush. It's more divided under Trump because he deliberately exploits the division. And that's, I think, one of his weaknesses running for re-election. Donald Trump is more of a populist, in my view, than a classic conservative. He doesn't talk much or seem to care much about government spending and national debt, which have always been big issues to conservatives. Both spending and debt have gotten out of control. Trump was never a favorite of the Tea Party movement in the Republican Party. The Tea Party was primarily concerned with spending and debt and making the government smaller. Small government is not one of Trump's classic themes. He's not a traditional conservative in that respect. In fact, in 2016, the candidate who represented the Tea Party was not Donald Trump. It was Ted Cruz of Texas. He came in second behind Trump for the nomination. A lot of traditional conservatives aren't supporting Donald Trump. George W. Bush, the former Republican president, didn't vote for Trump in 2016 and has indicated he won't vote for him for re-election now. Mitt Romney was he was the Republican nominee for president in 2012, and he's indicated that he will not vote for Donald Trump. But Trump is still getting nearly 90% support from rank-and-file Republican voters. Why? Well, I have a friend who's a leader in the religious right, and a couple of months ago, I asked him how he could support someone like Donald Trump, someone with Trump's values, someone with Trump's lifestyle, several wives, you all know the story. And he gave me an interesting answer. He said, Trump delivers. What does he deliver, I asked. And the man said, he delivers the thing that we have been praying for 50 years. And this was a couple of months ago, but the answer made more sense then than it does now. He said, I asked, what does he deliver? And my respondent said, he delivers what we've been praying for 50 years, the Supreme Court of the United States. In fact, that's been the core of their objections to the federal government for a long time. Now, the Supreme Court just last week made a couple of decisions which shows that the supposed conservative majority on the Supreme Court is not terribly reliable. We have 5 justices appointed by Republican presidents, including 2 appointed by Donald Trump. And on the first decision with respect to, the first decision was the Dreamers. No, was that the first one? I think so. The decision with respect to young people who were brought to the United States as children and whether they should be eligible to remain in the United States. John Roberts sided with the liberals on the court, so he wasn't part of a reliable conservative majority. Decisions, the first one was on gay rights, basically saying that gays should fall under the same category as other groups when they face discrimination in employment and other areas, and that discrimination against transsexuals and gays should not be allowed. John Roberts and even Neil Gorsuch, Trump's first appointee, voted with the liberals to expand the great gay rights coverage to include transsexuals. I don't know if you know what that is. These are people who change their sexual orientation formally change it from one sex to another. And on that decision, there was a real defection on the part of a couple of the, on the part of the, I think both Trump appointees. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader in the Senate, has made it clear to the president, to the White House, that if Ruth Ginsburg retires and Trump gets another appointee, the leader of the Senate has said his appointee will be confirmed very quickly, maybe within a week, by the Republican Senate, while there still is a Republican Senate. If Biden's elected, my guess is his first Supreme Court appointee will be Merrick Garland. Even though he's under pressure to appoint a black woman to the court, I think a lot of people would be pleased to see him appoint Merrick Garland. He's the judge whom President Obama appointed in his last year in office, and the Senate refused even to take up that nomination. Now, the issue that most Americans are discussing right now in the presidential race is who Joe Biden will pick as his vice presidential running mate. I always tell my students to take out a sheet of paper. If you have one, you can take one out. And I list 10 reasons to choose a vice president if you're the nominee. Write them down. Reason number 1, pick someone who will help you win. The other 9 reasons don't matter. You want to pick someone who's going to help you win. Now, you should know that Americans don't usually vote for vice president. I can prove that with 2 words: Dan Quayle. He was the first President Bush's choice for vice president. The polls that year showed throughout the campaign that most Americans did not think that Senator Quayle was qualified to be president, and they didn't even think he was qualified to be vice president. It's not clear what those qualifications are. A poor choice can hurt you, and that's what happened to John McCain when he picked Sarah Palin. The last time you can prove that a vice presidential selection really made a difference was way back in 1960 with Lyndon Johnson. John Kennedy, who was elected in 1960, he would never have won Texas without Lyndon Johnson on the ticket. You can show that that was a year in which the vice presidential selection made a crucial difference. But since 1960, which was a long time ago, 60 years ago, you can't prove that a vice presidential selection made a critical difference. In fact, another Massachusetts Democrat after Kennedy, his name was Michael Dukakis, he tried the same thing in 1988 by putting a Texan, Lloyd Bentsen, on the ticket, and it didn't mean a thing. Now, one thing that's very different this time is that Biden is going to be 78 years old when he takes office. And he has said many times that he has to choose someone who's fully prepared to become president instantly if anything should happen to President Biden. His choice for vice president has to have the right experience and knowledge to do the job, as clearly Biden believes he does. He's long experienced in national government. Right now, the top-ranked candidate, when polls ask Americans who would they like to see Biden, when they ask Democrats, who would they like to see Biden pick, Vice President Biden pick as his running mate, the top candidate right now is Kamala Harris, the senator from California. She has been elected Attorney General of California. She's a former prosecutor. She is an African-American woman. He promised to name a woman. In fact, that she's also an Indian-American woman. I can tell you a funny story about that. In 2016, when she won the Senate race in California, I was on the radio in California covering that race. And when she won, there were several of us on the radio. Someone pointed out that she'd be the first Indian American in the United States Senate since she had won that seat. And I rather foolishly interrupted and said, no, actually there was another Indian American in the Senate. Ben Nighthorse Campbell from Colorado, who was elected as a Democrat, but eventually he switched parties and became a Republican. And the other fellow on the air with me said, no, Bill, not that kind of Indian. She'd be the first Asian Indian to be in the United States Senate, not American, Native American, as they usually call. And there's also this. If Joe Biden's elected president, he'll be 82 at the end of his term. It's hard to see him or anyone running for re-election at age 82. which means when he names his vice presidential running mate, he very likely will be also picking the next Democratic nominee for president in 2024. And Democrats have got to keep that in mind. Right now in the United States, as you probably are aware, we are having this whole series of crises, three at the same time. The pandemic crisis, the protests over systemic racism and police behavior in the United States, and the economy is in the deepest recession since the Great Depression. All terrible problems that would make it very difficult for any president to get reelected. I would call this something I've written about, you can find it in my book, a consciousness-changing moment in the United States, and for that matter, in the world, because we're seeing protests all over the world. When I was very young, in 1955, when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery, Alabama bus, a municipal bus, to a white man. It was the law then, under the Jim Crow system, that an African American on public transportation had to give up his or her seat if a white, either a man or a woman, wanted to use the seat. Rosa Parks refused, and she was arrested for having refused. That was a dramatic moment because at that moment, I was a child then, but at that moment, millions of white Southerners suddenly realized something they should have known all along. They just didn't choose to talk about it or know it. They should have realized that segregation was not working and that African Americans in the South were enraged to be subject to Jim Crow laws. That was a real consciousness-changing moment, mostly for white people in the South. I saw it again, this kind of moment, when I started working at CNN back in 1991, and I was covering the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court in 1991. Until Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas, and she did so reluctantly, before she testified, sexual harassment was seen as a joke by many men in the United States. They called it flirting. After she testified about her humiliating experiences, sexual harassment was transformed overnight from a joke to a crime. That was another instance of consciousness changing, and it happened instantaneously. Another one, Matthew Shepard in 1998. Before that awful event where he was killed and left to die on a fence post in Wyoming by people who hated gays, Matthew Shepard was gay. Before that awful event, when I'd interview people about gay rights, they would always tell me they didn't see any reason to pass gay rights laws. It sounded like a solution for which there was no known problem. They said over and over again, what's the problem? Gays have the same rights as everyone else. After the crime was brought to light, people understood for the first time the brutality and hatred that many gay people face in this country, and consciousness was transformed. And now, of course, same-sex marriage is legal. There was a transformation in the view of that issue over a period of about 3 years that was breathtaking in its speed. I've never seen public opinion change so quickly on any issue. And I did some research on it and found out how it happened. Way back in the 1970s, when I was working with the Los Angeles Times, I actually wrote a question for the poll. It was the first poll ever taken on gay rights, asking people if they happen to know someone, a friend, a relative, a co-worker, who was openly homosexual. And at that time, 17% said yes. The question was asked again in 2006 by CBS News. Same question. And this time, over 70% of Americans said yes. Well, that's what made the crucial difference. It was a personal issue. People knew people, friends, relatives, co-workers, who were openly homosexual, and they found it totally unreasonable to support discrimination against someone they knew. That could be the root of what's happening right now. The big surprise right now is that so many white people, so many people who are not African American, are joining and supporting the protests against racial discrimination. I suspect that the apparent sudden transformation of racial attitudes that we are witnessing now in the United States has similar causes. More and more white people have friends relatives, neighbors, co-workers who are African American. And it makes no sense to them to support any kind of discrimination, much less abusive police behavior against people they know. Now, President Trump seems to be betting that it's 1968 again, and he's playing the role of Richard Nixon, that he can take advantage of a law and order backlash to the protests breaking out all over the country. But I remind you that in 1968, when the country was being torn apart by violence and hatred, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, he was the challenger. Hubert Humphrey represented the incumbent administration, the Democratic administration. He was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Trump is the incumbent now. What people were looking for in 1968, I think, is the same thing they're looking for now: normalcy. Nixon was deeply experienced in government. He had had all the top positions in government. He'd been nominated for president. He'd run for governor of California. He'd been a member of Congress. He had been a senator. He had been vice president of the United States with a very popular president. He represented normalcy. And people voted for him because they thought, well, let's just get back to normal and try to make the system work. He looked like he could hold the country together. And in fact, at the end of the 68 campaign, he adopted the theme of order. He saw a young girl holding a sign that said, "Bring us together." And he asked if he could hold up that sign. "Bring us together" was the theme that Nixon used to win in 1968. It wasn't a racial backlash. Donald Trump does not offer normalcy. I think when it comes to normalcy, that's more nearly what Joe Biden is offering with his long experience in government. He's the counterpart to Richard Nixon. Now, there's something changing in American politics that a lot of sociologists and political scientists have taken note of. It's partly, not completely, but partly a new pattern. Right now, especially during the Trump administration, this is old. The wealthier you are, the more likely you are to be a Republican. That's been true for about 100 years. But what's new is that the better educated you are, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. So I always have students in class raise their hand and they say, what if you're wealthy and well educated, which a lot of Americans are? Then you are what sociologists call cross-pressured. You're pulled in different directions. Your economic interests pull you to vote Republican. You want low taxes, less regulation, but your cultural values pull you to vote Democratic. A lot of suburban white voters have been fleeing the Republican Party because they see Trump as a less well-educated president, someone who doesn't have the right values. And so we're seeing a lot of Republican weakness now in suburbs all over the country. Now, Democrats have to be very careful in this campaign, as they do in every campaign. Democrats often fall into a trap, which is a difficult trap for them, and it often creates terrible electoral problems. I don't know if you know the word, but the Democratic trap is condescension. Trump's base is extremely sensitive to condescension. They don't like candidates who condescend to them. I don't know if you know what the word means, but it's a way of saying that the Democrats try to impose political correctness, are disdainful of a lot of Trump voters. They think they're uneducated, they're dirty. The Trump base is extremely sensitive to that. Obama blundered on that issue of condescension back in 2008 when he talked about people who cling to their guns and to their religion, as if he was casting aspersions. These aren't our kind of people. And they got very angry. Obama did win, but he won largely because the financial crisis was so overwhelming that people desperately wanted change. And Obama was African American, or is African American, and so it was hard to see him as condescending. Hillary Clinton made the same mistake. She became the Democratic candidate of condescension when she made a terrible blunder at a fundraiser in New York, and she called the Trump supporters a basket of deplorables. And the Trump supporters started wearing buttons saying, "I'm a deplorable." That was pure condescension. I doubt if Joe Biden could ever be condescending. I've known him for 40 years. It's not his nature. He's, of course, well educated. He went to some fine schools. He went to the University of Delaware. He went to Syracuse University Law School. Those are not Ivy League schools, like the Clintons and Obama and Trump. Trump went to Wharton School of Finance, which is Ivy League, which is part of the University of Pennsylvania. But I seriously doubt that Barack Obama, who identifies with a lot of working class voters, I don't think he could ever be condescending. Now, Trump, if I had to characterize his politics, I would do it this way. He has powerful populist instincts. Populist instincts. Now, there's certain strains of populism, and Trump really embodies all of them. Economically, he tends to be more moderate than conservative Republicans. He did what Republicans demand any new Republican president do. He delivered a big tax cut to keep conservatives happy. The first thing every Republican president elected has to do is deliver a tax cut. Then they get certified as acceptable to Republicans. Reagan passed a huge tax cut in his first year in 1981. George W. Bush passed a big tax cut in his first year in 2001. Trump passed a big tax cut in his first year in 2017. The only one who didn't was George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, who actually ended up approving of a sizable tax increase in 1990, and he paid a bitter price for that because his own party was furious at him for increasing rather than decreasing taxes. It's the first thing a new Republican president is expected to do. You deliver a tax cut, you get certified as kosher by conservatives and Republicans. Trump, in his campaign in 2016, promised to rebuild America's infrastructure, which is crumbling in a lot of the country. Much of it was built in the New Deal in the 1930s. Roads, bridges, and especially, this is his biggest complaint, airports. He complains about the state of American airports because, of course, he has a private plane and flies everywhere. He would like to rebuild airports all over the United States. Probably he'll want to name all of them Trump Airport Miami, Trump Airport New York, Trump Airport Los Angeles, but he wants to rebuild the nation's infrastructure. This is what Roman emperors used to do. They didn't have airports, but they built huge public works in tribute to themselves. They called it bread and circuses. Well, he promised a big infrastructure program, and on that issue, Democrats tended to be supportive of the president. Elizabeth Warren thought his infrastructure program was and still is a very good idea because for Democrats, it means jobs. And in that respect, it's a economically populist issue. But on social and cultural issues, Trump is very conservative. That's what gives him legitimacy for those white working class voters who tend to be his base. His signature issue in 2016, as it is still today, is illegal immigration. He claims it's not all immigration, it's illegal immigration, which white working class voters see as a very serious threat. And now, of course, since the protests broke out, he has called himself President Law and Order, where he's trying to imitate what he thought was the Nixon program in 1968. Nixon adopted law and order, but largely after he became president with his vice president, Spiro Agnew, who became a big advocate of law and order, and worked for the Republicans when Nixon got reelected in 1972. But he became a full-fledged law and order candidate in 1972, not 1968. Now let me talk a little bit, since you're in Korea, about Trump's foreign policy. I would judge President Trump to be an isolationist. For 72 years in the United States, since Harry Truman was president, the United States has acknowledged that this country has international interests as well as national interests. President Clinton said in 1997, in his second inaugural address, "America stands alone as the world's indispensable nation." Under Trump, that's really not true anymore. It ended when President Trump withdrew U.S. forces from Syria, abandoning our Kurdish allies in Syria, and President Trump said, "Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand. It's not our problem." Since World War II, whenever there's been a serious threat to world order or to humanitarian values, one rule has applied. If the United States doesn't do anything about the threat, nothing will happen. The United States has to act. What would have happened if the United States had failed to act after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990? Most likely nothing. Kuwait would now be a part of Iraq. Having acted in Kuwait, the first President Bush left the crisis in the Balkans to the Europeans. It was Europe's backyard. The United States has never had any vital interests in the Balkans. So what happened when we declined to intervene? Nothing happened. The Europeans failed to act, and a new horror entered the world's vocabulary: ethnic cleansing. Eventually, the United States felt morally compelled after seeing the pictures, they came from the BBC, the pictures of Kosovars being shoved into trains and going to concentration camps. Eventually, the United States felt morally compelled to step in and lead a NATO mission to end the brutality. When atrocities occurred in Cambodia and Rwanda and Congo and Darfur and now Burma, the whole world, including the United States, looked away. So nothing happened. And the result in those cases was genocide. It is very hard to imagine a peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians that's not guaranteed by the United States. The political establishments of both political parties have acknowledged U.S. international interests since 1947. That's when President Truman, in a famous speech to a joint session of Congress, called for the United States to abandon its historic isolationism and assume leadership of the free world in its global struggle against communism. President Obama's Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, captured the sentiment of the nation's political establishment perfectly back in 2013 when he made this point to the New York Times during the debate over Syria. Quote, "One thing for Congress to consider," Mr. Rhodes said, "one thing for Congress to consider is the message that this debate over U.S. troops in Syria sends about U.S. leadership around the world, that the U.S. for decades has played the role of undergirding the global security architecture and enforcing international norms. We do not want to send a message that the United States is getting out of that business in any way." The problem is, that's a message that a lot of Americans do want to send. And that's the message that President Trump is sending. We want to get out of the business of guaranteeing international order and humanitarian values. It's too expensive for the United States. And the president was always complaining that other countries, including Japan, South Korea, Western Europe, they're not paying their fair share. They're too reliant on the United States. Now, one final point I'll make about the election. There is a nightmare scenario that Americans have begun to talk about. What if Trump loses by a fairly narrow margin, which looks pretty likely? Will he leave office? I've also studied British politics. I was in Britain in 1974, a long time ago. The Conservatives were in power. The Prime Minister was Ted Heath. And the election in 1974, when the Conservatives were in office, the election ended without any party getting a solid majority, which is required to form a government in Britain. In Britain, they have a tradition we don't have in the United States. When a party loses an election, they vacate the Prime Minister's offices and residence immediately. They're out within a day or two, and the new government takes over because the old government no longer has the mandate of the people. We don't do that in the United States. We used to have like 4 months between election day and the new government, the new president taking office. Now it's a little bit shorter. But what happened in Britain in 1974 is Ted Heath stayed at number 10 Downing Street and didn't leave for a few days. And when I was in London, I treasured a newspaper that I found. It was a labor-oriented newspaper that had a picture of Ted Heath on the front page, looking puzzled. And the gigantic headline said, "For the love of God, go. For the love of God, go." They were imploring the Prime Minister, this was a labor newspaper, to leave office. And eventually the Labor Party, under Harold Wilson then, did take power. We could see that same headline in the United States. President Trump is perfectly capable of refusing to give up his office. He's indicated that he could charge fraud and abuse in the election. He's preparing to mount a legal challenge if the result doesn't go his way, arguing widespread voter fraud. He's preparing the way now by criticizing the adoption of postal ballots, balloting by mail in many states around the country. He claims, without any evidence, that postal balloting is ridden with fraud, and it's very easy to cheat, and for people who should not be allowed to vote by mail ballot. This is a very serious matter. The election may not be over. Election night will probably certainly not be over, because given the pandemic in most states, lots of people are sending in ballots by mail. I have problems with ballots by mail, but not the same ones that Trump has. He claims that ineligible people who want to commit fraud will be voting. My problem with mail balloting is twofold. One is there's no guarantee of a secret ballot. You can have a father or a brother or anyone say to you, I want to see how you vote before you mail your ballot in, or you're not getting an allowance. A father can say to his son or a daughter, or a wife to a husband. There's no guarantee of a secret ballot. And second of all, people vote sometimes a week or two before the election. And then something dramatic happens before the election. And I've seen it in many cases, principally in California where I've covered elections. People want to get their ballot back. It's too late. They can't. The ballot has already been cast. So there are problems, but not the ones that President Trump talks about. He is preparing a legal challenge, arguing voter fraud in states that where he loses by a close margin. We could, and this is the nightmare scenario, I call it, we could end up with what's known as a contingent election for the first time since 1824. That's an election where, because of lawsuits pending in the courts, some states can't cast their electoral vote. No one gets a majority of the electoral college. And then if that happens, the whole election changes. It goes to the House of Representatives, where every state gets one vote. One vote. California has 40 million people. One vote. Wyoming has 500,000 people. One vote. Right now, 26 states have a Republican majority in the House, 22 have a Democratic majority, and there are a couple of states that are tied. But that doesn't matter, because the House that votes in a contingent election is the House that's elected in November. We haven't had that election yet. So there's no way to tell what would happen if the election goes to the House of Representatives. All we know is that President Trump appears to be proceeding as if he wants to challenge the result of the election in states that he loses by a small margin. And he's preparing to do it on the basis of mail voting fraud. That could stretch the election out, create more bitterness in the United States, and not a nearly unprecedented situation, unprecedented since 1824. I will conclude now and be happy to answer any questions you have about what's happening or will happen or could happen in the election. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Professor Schneider. That was very thorough. It's a lot of good material for our discussion. So let me turn now to our second presentation, Professor Young-kun Seo.
Thanks for having me on. I'm Jung-kun Seo from Korea. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science at Kyunghee University in Seoul, Korea. And I spent about 15 years in the United States, 2 years in San Diego for master's program, 7 years in Austin, Texas for PhD program, and 5 years of teaching at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and then came back to my home country in 2012. So I've been enjoying my home life in Seoul, Korea. So this is a great opportunity to share my thoughts on the U.S. election, U.S. presidential election and South Korea as well. I made my paper's title intentionally provocative. So I hope that everybody likes it. Why do we care? Meaning, we meaning South Koreans. I guess Dr. Schneider, Dean Rozelle, and others have been so curious about why South Koreans are so concerned and curious about the US presidential election. So I just wanted to share what we South Koreans have thought about the United States elections and its impacts on the Korean Peninsula. So as Dr. Schneider has made such a thorough presentation, I would like to make my presentation as quick as possible so that everybody else can jump in for discussion. Before I move on, I just wanted to show you some contrasting world map, if you will. The left side of the world map is what you can find in the Korean search engine on the internet. We call it Naver. That Naver is a Google in Korea, if you will. And we have this world map. We have seen this world map ever since we were children. So Pacific Ocean is located at the center, and the left side is Asia, right side is North America. So this is the world map we have long seen since the childhood. And I have realized that American people have different world map for their lifetime. The right side is the United States is located there. The Pacific Ocean is there, but the Atlantic Ocean is at the center, and then Europe, and then Russia, and then Asia. So there is no wonder why South Korea and North Korea are called Far East. So this is something I would like to share with everybody else as an indication of how much a difference South Koreans and Americans might have in terms of their perceptions and their understandings of each other. And as my paper's title indicated, we South Koreans do care about the US presidential election. And this is such an interesting result of the Gallup poll conducted in 2016. And the left side of the column, there are some Korean languages in there. So you just trust me, I'm not lying. This is not a fake news. We have conducted, the Gallup conducted 40 to 50 countries asking the question, which candidate would you would choose? Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. And Korea, Republic South, that's South Korea, we chose 80%, Hillary Clinton by 82%, and Donald Trump only 3%. If you look at China, at the very bottom, 53% for Clinton, 44% for Trump. That was a very interesting difference between South Korea and China, even if they are all located in East Asia. And the right side column is something I wanted to show you. The question was how much influence the US presidential election might have on your country. Number one is South Korea. Great deal, somewhat. So 68% and 23%. The total is 91% of South Koreans believed that the United States presidential election was very, very influential on their own country. So Korea ranked first. So that's why I thought that we care about the United States presidential election. And Dr. Schneider has walked us through a whole history of American political institutions and elections. I so loved it. And this is my turn to show you some memorable photos of the United States presidential election in South Korea. The upper left is, as you all know, just prior to 1952 election, Republican candidate Dwight Eisenhower mentioned that I shall go to Korea. in the midst of the Korean War. And actually, he came to Korea as a president-elect in the month of in the month of December the 4th here. So Eisenhower was here in South Korea right after the election, and Adlai Stevenson, who was defeated by Eisenhower in 1952, he was asked by reporters about reason why he was defeated. Adlai Stevenson said, "Korea, Korea, Korea." That was an interesting answer any losing president candidate in the United States could give. The upper right side is President Jimmy Carter. When he was running in 1976 election, he pledged to withdraw some of the military forces on the Korean Peninsula. So then president in South Korea was President Park. He was general turned president. He made a coup in 1961, and he did not like Jimmy Carter's pledge to withdraw or draw down of the US troops in South Korea. So they got very bitter relationship with each other when Jimmy Carter was visiting South Korea. The lower left side is not that famous, but I found it very fascinating. When Dick Gephardt of the Democratic Party was running for the election in 1988, during the primary, he made this campaign commercial titled Hyundai. So he argued back then that Korean government slaps on 9 separate taxes and tariffs on Chrysler. So it was unfair trade between South Korea and the United States. So Dick Gephardt mentioned about South Korea when he was running for the presidential election in 1988. And fast forwarding, and we got Donald Trump in 2016. During the convention and during the campaigns, he mentioned that a free trade deal with South Korea was job-killing deal. And he was going to press South Korea for paying more for US troops on the Korean Peninsula. So what my point here is that since the Second World War, South Korea and the United States have had military alliances relationship, but the United States president election per se was not that highly quite mentioned about South Korea over the course of time. So that was my sort of short sort of history kind of revisited there. And I have I guess I have 5 different questions very briefly as some sort of kind of discussion questions for everybody here on the panel. The first question is this: could only Trump go to Pyongyang? So now everybody can understand where this came from. I don't know why, but Dr. Snyder's presentation and Dean Rozelle's piece on the Hill, they all mentioned about Nixon. And we've got memorable phrase saying that only Nixon could go to China. So my paraphrasing of that famous history / political experience of the United States is, could only Trump go to Pyongyang? So at this point of time, what I'm referring to is not Trump as anti-communist, but Trump as a Republican president. So my understanding of the American political institutions is that when Republican president is trying to negotiate with North Korean leader, Republican hawks on Capitol Hill tend to be silent about their president's kind of negotiation and strategies. We can remember Bill Clinton in 1990s. We can remember Barack Obama since 2008. They all Democratic presidents trying to negotiate with North Korea. And at the very next day, Republican members of the Senate were so quick, wasting no time, criticizing Democratic president, reaching out to North Korean dictator. But what about Trump? Lindsey Graham is so silent. Nobody else is talking about any bad things about Trump going to sort of negotiate with North Korea. So that's why I brought up this question. This is the Louis Fisher, the famous constitutional scholar of the United States, in his own book published in 2003. This has a lot to do with John Bolton too. So 2002, 2001, September 11, and 2002, right before the midterm elections, very interesting White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card gave an interesting reason for waiting until September. From a marketing point of view, you don't introduce new products in August. So, I mean, that's the Trump and Kim Jong-un in October surprise kind of a possibility. That's what I'm talking about. So I don't have enough time, so let me just go quickly. Number two issue is there a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? What I'm talking about here is, I'm not, don't get me wrong, I'm not pro North Korea or whatsoever. But let me just point out that there is the fact that there could be North Korean version of trust but verify. I mean, Bill Schneider and Dean Rozelle all can remember Ronald Reagan's famous statement, trust but verify, against Soviet Union. So people only tend to believe that, oh, there's only one version of trust but verify by the United States. But let's think about the other way around. Like, North Korea should be able to also trust the United States and verify the promises made by the United States. So the big deal kind of approach to North Korea is not realistic. That's my whole point. If I have enough time later on, I'll elaborate on more on this point. Number three, I'm really curious about this stuff. I'm really trying to get some smart comments from Bill and Dean Rozelle. Is Burdensharing really helping Trump's reelection? I mean, we Koreans are so upset about Trump's push for pay more for troops in South Korea. We've been paying for almost 50% of the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. So when Trump is pushing and pushing for more burden sharing, is it really helping Trump's reelection? I'm really curious. So my thing is, anti-American sentiments might be occurring in South Korea. So I mean, I'm just curious about this whole picture of Trump's pushing for burden sharing. Number four, Biden administration, how different? Well, I mean, I don't know. It's just kind of, I'm just worried about Democratic president coming again, trying to negotiate with North Korea, being attacked unfairly by the Republican members of Congress. So it's kind of a thing. And then what about the senator from Korea? I mean, Bill Schneider and Dean Rozelle, I mean, might be old enough to remember his name, William Noland of California. His nickname was Senator from Formosa. He was a strong, ardent supporter of Taiwan in the 1960s, 1950s. But what about Senator from Korea? Do you have one or not? And that's my question too. And my final slide here is this. Dean Rozelle's piece, I read it, so I so enjoyed the piece on the Hill by Dean Rozelle. So Trump seems to be kind of law and order candidate, and he was talking about silent majority in the Tulsa rally yesterday as well. Oh, by the way, South Korean influence on U.S. presidential election. A lot of empty blue seats in BOK, Tulsa. A part of it was by K-pop fans. it was on the New York Times. So what a global world when we have. So my final point here is that my question is, voter attitudes changing? Is the culture we're shifting? As Dr. Schneider and Dean Rozelle mentioned. Now in the nationwide, but what about pivot counties? So pivot counties meaning the counties that voted Obama 08, Obama 12, but Trump in 16. So we call them pivot counties, and they're located in the Midwest areas. So kind of culture we're shifting, maybe in the nationwide, but what about culture we're shifting in the pivot counties? That's my question. So I have sort of summarized kind of questions we South Koreans have when it comes to the US presidential election. Okay, so that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. It gives us a lot more material to discuss. So you posed some questions, and I'll come back later to those. I think I should defer to the panel discussants first. And so we can go in any order. We have Dr. Sung-Jin Yu and Dr. So-Young Kwon as our discussants. So I have in order on my form here, Dr. Sung-Jin Yu, you want to open with your discussion first?
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, it's a great opportunity for me to have an idea with you. I mean, the renowned professor like Bill Schneider and Dean Rozelle. Well, personally, I've read several articles written by Mark Rozelle with Clyde Wilcox. So, and because I'm interested in the Tea Party and religion's impact in U.S. politics. And well, the presentation gives a lot of information, but still I have wondering on the Trump strategy in this election. Well, it seems that Trump sticks to his approach, his strategy in 2016, as Professor Schneider mentioned, on this election again. And well, in perspective of Trump, where this election has a lot of troubles for Trump, it seems that because Supreme Court's decision, two important decisions made by Supreme Court, has a very different approach from the Trump perspective, and some Republicans criticize his approach, and also even the social network service, Facebook and Twitter, put a regulation on his remarks on social network service. So he faced with several troubles in this election. But on the other hand, he is sticking to his approach because his approval rates remain to be same. He started his term with low 40s approval rates, and the approval rates remaining to be similar degree even 3 years after his term, and it has not been changing so much, even though we have a pandemic crisis these days and economic crisis these days, even the racial prejudice and protest. So his approval rate is constant, sort of the constant, which means that he has, in this election, he had still very strong basis, and it worked in 2016, and I remember that, and Professor Schneider mentioned that 2012, 2016, nobody expected Donald Trump to be president. So, and Democratic Party was very optimistic, and they were worried about the election outcome at that moment. But it turned out to be Donald Trump became president. And I'm wondering what is different between 2016 and 2012, where we have different candidates from Democratic parties. Joe Biden is a new candidate, but he's still one of the establishment politician. And I have some reservation. He is more attractive than Hillary Clinton. But so then that doesn't make big difference. So is there any reason for Donald Trump to change his approach in this election? Because he have given that he has very strong base and it worked, and he believed it will work again in 2012, this election. And my second question is that where mail-in vote controversy, where Professor Schneider will talk about what will be after where if Donald Trump lose the election in a narrow margin, he doesn't leave the office for a while, right? And he mentioned already where election fraud and mail-in vote has a lot of problem, and the truth is that it will take a long time. It will take days or even weeks to count the vote by mail. So the US electorate need to wait for a while for their final decision. So is there any way for US Congress or US institution to resolve such a problem, such a confusion? If Donald Trump will insist he remain to be in office. So that would be my two questions for Professor Schneider.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, and before we go to the round of answering our questions, we have now discussant, Dr. So-Young Kwon. Dr. Kwon.
Well, thank you so much for the overview on the US presidential election. I mean, the US presidential election is certainly an affair of American domestic politics. However, the whole world is watching since it will have a direct and significant impact on global politics. Especially foreign issues would not be the primary concerns for the American voters, but candidates' viewpoint on global world order will be pretty significant. So far, I've been following the series of webinars, and we have touched upon important foundations of knowledge, such as the main features of the electoral system, the candidatures, and prospects. And by following all the information, I've been trying to see what may be the campaign strategies for both Trump and Biden to win. And I have not yet seen anything clear in terms of how they're going to actually move around with the system to win. And also by looking at what Trump is getting into, I wonder whether this is part of his campaign strategies to win, or he's just unfortunate to fall into all this tragic and unfortunate events that are unfolding. Obviously, COVID-19 is not something planned, but the reaction to COVID-19 maybe somehow fall into the strategic thinking in terms of how to win, unless he has no interest of continuing his presidency. Well, today's session, I think it's probably the highlight of the series for the outsiders watching the unfolding events that might affect the election outcomes. So I've actually heard with great interest of Professor Sa's presentation, Why Do We Care?, which well summarizes what the US presidential election means to South Korea. But this may also be the case for China, Russia, and other European countries too. I could see that some countries would like to see Trump continue his presidency because they might prefer devil you know than the devil you don't. But most of the countries in the West and allies would probably like to see some change since Trump thinks and acts beyond the conventional framework of politics, diplomacy, and foreign relations, which make it very difficult to build up trust and credibility of the United States. Especially when we see Trump's words on SNS, like his remarks on tweets, way more than the official press release, is definitely problematic for those involved in foreign policies. And probably this is more so for North Korea, that's at the crossroad of the relationship with the United States. And North Korea certainly have experienced the leadership change in the US, which brought a new US-North Korea policy. So should there be a new president, North Korea might need to start the discussion all over again. If Trump gets reelected, they might want to push for the unfinished business that they have been conducting. So I go back to bringing the Asia-centric perspective on the US presidential election. In 2004, 2016, we saw the unexpected outcome of the US presidential election, partly blaming the electoral system of the United States, but perhaps maybe the outsiders have limited understanding on US policy priorities or American preferences. I don't know whether this is the case or not, but if I should bring the Asia perspective, we would be more interested in the outcomes rather than the process or campaign strategies. In other words, we are more intrigued by the speculations of who would win and what are the candidates' viewpoints on diverse domestic and global issues and their foreign policy priorities. So at this point, I would like to raise some general questions for each panelist and a more broad question for us to think about at this concluding session. So number one, my main inquiry will be, how would the prospect and candidature features have changed since the start of these webinar sessions in May? Because I remember Dean Rozelle giving a presentation, and he actually said that there is some chance for Trump to win. At this point of time, it looks pretty bad for Trump, but can there be a turnaround? Because we still have some time, and whether it could still change. I guess we cannot really predict the accurate outcomes at this point of time, but I wanted to see whether this bad situation will continue until the end, or is there any chance for this to be restored? My second question would go to Professor Hall, and it's a really hot issue now about Bolton's book on the room where it happened, the White House memoir. And I don't know whether you have read it or not, but it really discloses a lot about US-Korea relations, and especially North Korea relations. It sort of reveals that Trump never had a serious intent on making a deal with North Korea. And it seems like the South Korea was pushing the Americans to meet with Kim Jong-un, and Trump was more concerned about his publicity rather than the working level issues. So I was wondering how you think about this, and what would be the impact of this book on Trump? My third question is more broad, and this really goes to Professor Schneider. I think it will be very helpful for us to compare and contrast some hypothetical scenarios in which Trump gets reelected, or if Biden gets reelected. For instance, if in these two hypothetical scenarios, what will be change and continuity on the issues of US-China relations, US leadership in the world, US support for international regime or international organizations, social order, immigration, and climate change, all these issues combined, whether there will be change or continuity even when Trump gets reelected. So I think this would be something for you to give a little bit of a briefing for the Asian audience. I personally think the core of alternative scenario by the new president of the United States is what can be undone and restored. be it American values, democracy, responsible leadership, or credibility. And I wonder if Biden can offer that to the damaged US reputation in the world. So that is another big question, and I will leave it here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Kwon. So now is our, I guess, freewheeling discussion session, right? We can take some of these questions. Bill Schneider, I think, some questions have been posed to you. A few have been posed to me. I'll just quickly jump in on one topic. Can there be a turnaround? My answer is yes. I'd love to hear what Bill has to say about that. Right now, the Electoral College math does not look very good for Donald Trump. The polling data show, as Professor Schneider pointed out, that he's got a very, very difficult path to winning re-election at this time. As Professor Schneider said, a lot can happen in 4 months. Just imagine, for example, there's a very strong third economic quarter report in the United States just prior to the election, and a vaccine. I don't know what the chances are of those two things happening, but you could see circumstances changing rather significantly between now and November. And the one thing we're not really sure about is what kind of campaigner Joe Biden's going to be in this election cycle. A lot of people are actually very concerned about his advanced age and his, his verbal acuity, that he has a propensity to make misstatements that are easily mocked. Is he going to be as strong a candidate as he looks right now after the barrage of negative ads and unprecedented campaign spending by the Trump re-election campaign? So I think a lot can happen between now and November, but I'll defer to Professor Schneider on that question and others that have been posed.
Well, of course, a lot of things can happen in the next 4 months. I can't remember who said this. I think it was Harold Wilson. He said, in politics, a week can be a very long time, as it often is. If you want to know what will happen if Biden becomes president, I would suggest the easiest way to summarize that is Obama's presidency. We'll be going back essentially to what was happening in the United States and in the world under President Obama. If you like President Obama and thought his foreign policy was good, then you'll probably like Joe Biden. It's not likely to be very different. It's an establishment foreign policy. The Democrats will go back to the assumption that the United States has international interests. There'll still be a lot of skittishness about American intervention in the rest of the world. So I would say, if you like Obama, you'll like Trump. One of the big changes, one of the big issues is likely to be the issue of China. Trump is trying to attack Joe Biden as being too favorably inclined towards China. Trump is trying to make China a key issue in this election. You'll notice that whenever he talks about the pandemic, he talks about the disease as having originated in China. He calls it the Chinese flu. He made a little joke Saturday in his remarks at the campaign rally. He called it the Kung flu, which was a racist remark. But he clearly intends to run not just against Democrats and Biden, but also against China, even though he himself has said very good things about China and has been very warmly disposed towards the president of China. Trump thinks it's to his advantage to make China the issue. That could be a very interesting outcome. The American attitude towards China is suspicious, but not overwhelmingly hostile the way it used to be towards Russia during the Cold War. I don't see another Cold War emerging with China at this point. As the questioner asked, she asked something about the Bolton book. The John Bolton book is, of course, a big shock to many Americans, although not really a surprise to many of Trump's critics. The impact is, Democrats are angry because John Bolton did not testify during the impeachment hearings. And what he mentions in his book are lots of instances where Donald Trump committed what could be called legally obstruction of justice. He wanted to intervene in cases where China had an interest, where Turkey had an interest. That could have all been used by Democrats in their effort to impeach and remove President Trump. But Bolton refused to testify. He said if he were subpoenaed, he would sue. So the Democrats really didn't want to go through that. And the impeachment effort, it succeeded in the president's being impeached, but he couldn't be removed. In fact, I think it was almost impossible for him to be removed by the Republican Senate because Republicans are terrified of Donald Trump. That's the one advantage he has. If any Republican office holder says anything even remotely critical of Donald Trump, he has an army. His army, as I indicated earlier, is about a third of the electorate, but it's a majority. It can be a majority in the Republican primaries in most states and congressional districts. And Republican office holders have learned that if they dare to criticize Donald Trump, who is extremely sensitive to criticism, their career as politicians is likely to be finished. So you won't hear much criticism from them. I think the way most voters will see this is that this is a vote, the election of this year is a vote whether to continue things the way Trump is going, which doesn't look very good right now, or to go back to the Obama administration. President Obama's ratings have been rising since Trump took office, and he's now one of the most popular ex-presidents that we have. It's up in the high 50s. So that's the way most Americans see it. People keep asking about the Biden strategy. I don't think Biden has a real strategy. He doesn't need one. If you're fed up with Trump and you dislike him or hate him, Joe Biden is there. All he has to do is be the alternative to Donald Trump and to show that he's not doddering on the edge of some terrible health catastrophe so that people can feel comfortable voting for him. Trump's losses, and the reason why he looks so weak in the polls, are principally among two groups. One of them is women, who have never been very favorable to Trump, and he's losing even white working class women who are among his strongest supporters. Men he's holding on to, but not women. And the other is even more dangerous group, and that's seniors, people who are over 65 in the United States. They were Trump's strong supporters in 2016, but we're seeing a lot of evidence of weakness among seniors in this election, and that could make a huge difference in states where the senior population is very large. The state with the largest senior population is Florida, and after that, a bit of a surprise to most Americans is Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a swing state that has a large population of seniors. They're upset by the instability they associate with the Donald Trump administration, his mercurial nature. It's clear what Trump is going to do in this election is demonize Joe Biden. That's what he always does, to try to argue that Joe Biden is totally unacceptable as a leader, as president. It's going to be a very harsh and bitter election. And the choice for most Americans is continue with Trump or go back to Obama. That's the way I think the issue is really framed.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And, with the over 65 voters, another issue has been the COVID-19 spread. So, who is the most vulnerable of all citizens in the United States? It's the older population, and there's a widespread perception that the president has done a terrible job at managing this particular crisis. So that plays right into his base. And then there's some polling data recently showing that there's a marginal but not insignificant drop in support for the president among white evangelicals who were the core of his electoral base in 2016. He won 81% of the vote of white evangelical Christians. He did better than George W. Bush did with white evangelicals, which is quite remarkable. I would say it's game over if he starts to lose some significant support among the evangelical core in the Republican Party, because they have been the most loyal of any to his presidency. On the question earlier about making other countries pay more for their military commitments, in which the United States has made a commitment abroad, or cutting aid to foreign countries, the answer to the question is that this is entirely for domestic political consumption in an election year. It's nothing more complicated than that. If you look at polling data in the United States, there have been some fascinating polls in the past that ask Americans, what percentage of the US federal budget do you think this country spends on foreign aid? And it's like over 20%, according to the American population, when it's actually less than 1% of our entire federal budget. You can ask questions about our how much spending on our military commitments, right, to our allies and the like, you would get the same answer, right? That Americans would say, oh, it's an enormous amount of our federal budget. We should be spending our money here at home. So the reality and the perception are very much in contrast with each other, and it matters politically, and it plays into Mr. Trump's hands as a candidate when he says past political leaders made bad deals, that we've been spending money all around the world and everybody else is taking advantage of us and they're not paying their fair share. Doesn't matter if it's accurate. It only matters if it comports with a general perception within the voting public that says, no, 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 we should be putting things into America first and not sending our money to those other countries, make them pay more.
But what's interesting though is if you ask Trump supporters about whether they support U.S. troops staying on the Korean Peninsula, I found one polling saying that it's about 70 to 80% they support the U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. So staying in South Korea versus making South Korean government pay more, I mean, can they separate from one from the other? I mean, that might be one kind of complex question I had earlier. And just one more quick comment about John Bolton's book is that I really believe that John Bolton's book is showcasing a harsh reality South Korea is facing when it comes to U.S. foreign policy towards South Korea. Because we've got an American president who is only concerned about his own political benefit, having no knowledge about foreign policy. But at the same time, we've got the American foreign policy community symbolized by John Bolton, who only care about American grand strategy. They don't care about the reunification of the two Koreas. They don't really care about South Korea as an ally. So this is kind of very harsh reality we might face, we as South Koreans. But at the same time, if you look at a brighter side of the story, I think this is they are giving us some new homework we have to do in this era of post 9/11, post Iraq War. So South Korea should do something like a Korea first strategy vis-a-vis America first strategy. I think this is the right time for South Korean government and the public to reconsider the whole picture of the relation. I'm for U.S.-South Korea military alliances, but this is a partnership. So one of your partners is changing. Well, there might be not much choices left. So that's my whole point. So John Bolton's book is not just kind of anecdotal story, but this is a kind of harsh reality giving us some homework we have to fulfill.
Very good, thank you. I will let others jump in, either Dr. Schneider or Dr. Kwan. This touches a little bit more on your expertise than it does on mine. Please feel free to respond.
I would start with the assumption, it's not an assumption, it's a fact. Trump is an isolationist. He doesn't really care much about the rest of the world. And he is, as I indicated, the first president in over 70 years to shrug his shoulders about America's responsibility for maintaining world order and humanitarian values. That's something we came into after World War II, when Britain could no longer bear that responsibility. President Truman boldly went before Congress in 1947 and said, we will be responsible for protecting world order. When Ben Rhodes made that criticism that I quoted, he was saying, you have to understand what's happening now. The United States, the leadership of the United States is, under Trump, is really willing to cast that burden aside. I can tell you most Americans are too. Trump complains that it's too expensive, that when we commit troops abroad, it's always risking American lives for what he sees as no particular purpose. Americans are war weary. So I think Trump has genuinely hit a populist nerve when he talks about this kind of isolationist foreign policy. And that's been true. American foreign policy for the first 200 years was essentially isolationist. I mean, look, we didn't get into World War I until the last year of a 4-year-long war. We didn't get into World War II until all of Europe had fallen under Nazi domination, and we were attacked at Pearl Harbor. The United States, despite the concerns of a lot of liberals, the United States was very reluctant to take military action or to go to war. One piece of evidence is the one thing that I know John Bolton was most upset about. He mentions it in the portion of the book that I read. John Bolton, wants the United States to invade Iran. That's very clear. That's a neoconservative dream. Get rid of the government of Iran. He was not happy after Iran shot down the American drone, and the president indicated that he wanted to retaliate in some way. And John Bolton talks about the fact that he went to bed that night certain that the president was going to have some kind of an attack on Iran, and the next morning nothing had happened. And when he mentioned it, asked the president, why didn't we invade Iran? Why didn't we attack them after they attacked our drone? The president's answer was very simple: too many body bags. That's what Bolton said in his book. The president's response was too many body bags. That is a genuine American populist response. Why should we sacrifice American lives, not to mention American money, but why should we sacrifice our lives in a risky venture that may not work out very well? One thing that a lot of people like about Donald Trump is he doesn't seem to be particularly eager to get involved in other countries' problems or conflicts.
Sure.
Would others like to jump in on that or other points?
Well, on perception and reality, Trump is very good at blaming others for some situation, some trouble. So for COVID-19 crisis, he's blaming China for this crisis.
Yes.
And that gives some perception to the US public. And I found one poll in the United States pointed out that most of Republicans believe that China should take responsibilities in one way or another for this crisis, not Donald Trump. So in that sense, where perception would be more matter than reality, and it worked in 2016. So do you believe it doesn't work this year?
You know, my initial thought is to think back to the 2016 election cycle. The brilliance of Donald Trump's campaign was, as I pointed out in our webinar several weeks ago, breaking the blue wall in the upper Midwest, manufacturing sector states in the Great Lakes area, right? The 3 states that he wasn't supposed to win that he did win, with some significant support among voters who typically had voted in the past Democratic. So with globalization and the perception that the decline of the manufacturing sector was due to unfair competition, bad deals that American leaders had made, that we had been taken advantage of. Trump was very effective, right, at projecting blame to those in other countries, right, those others, for the ills that had affected the domestic economy in that region of the country. And that played very, very well. Hillary Clinton was saying to those in the coal mining industry, maybe you need to retool, re-educate, find another line of work. Trump is saying, we're going to bring back, coal. We're going to bring back the steel industry. It had strong domestic political appeal among those people in those communities whose lifestyles, their livelihoods had been devastated since the rise of globalization, right? So Trump was speaking to those people. Now, 4 years later, are their lives any better? Has there been a resurgence of these old industries, and have these communities come back, right? It's easy to say what you would do differently than those in power and to blame them for the circumstances under which people live. But now Mr. Trump is the incumbent. And I think there is some limit to how much he can project blame onto the other for the situation in the United States when he's been the leader for 3.5 years and had time to do something about it. So my belief is it doesn't carry as much weight this time as it did 4 years ago.
I have a question for Bill Schneider and Dean Rozelle. I mean, when we comes to revisiting the history of the United States presidential elections, I'm thinking about 1968 election and 1972 election, back-to-back Nixon won. So 1960, so I believe at this point of time, 2016 was the resentment election. And I'm not necessarily sure whether 2020 election is going to be another version of resentment election. I would believe that this time around, it would be Trump election. But if you go back to the 1968 and 1972 elections back to back, Nixon seemed to use the rhetoric quite effectively, law and order, silent majority in 1968. And what about 1972, when he crushed George McGovern in 1972 elections? So is it kind of back-to-back same, similar type of message working in the case of Nixon? What do you think?
Let me point something out about what you just mentioned, 1968 and 1972. A lot of people misread what happened. In 1968, in that presidential election, Richard Nixon's worst state, where he got the lowest percentage of the vote, was Mississippi, Deep South. Nixon got 13.5% of the vote in Mississippi. Who won Mississippi in 1968? George Wallace, the independent candidate. He got 63.5% of the vote in Mississippi. In 1972, 4 years later, you know what happened in Mississippi? Nixon carried 78% of the vote. It became his best state. It went from his worst state to his best state. How did he do it? He folded the Wallace vote into the Republican vote. And that is the Republican strategy that's been carried out over the past 50 years. They have folded the Wallace vote, the white racial backlash vote, into the Republican Party. And now they're paying the price for that. Because a lot of Americans don't support that kind of politics. But that's exactly what the Republicans did. And I would argue, I did recently in a piece that I wrote, that this is Wallaceism triumphant. Trump represents the Wallace strain more than the Nixon strain in the Republican Party. But it's been part of the Republican Party ever since 1972. And that is where Trump is coming from.
Yeah, I think that says it all. Thank you, Dr. Schneider. I think we have time for one final question, comment, and then I will close the session briefly with a few comments. Okay, I think we're at the point where we can finish up the session momentarily. I just wanted to share something because when I made my presentation a month ago, I had
I remember that.
Yeah, I had given a very different scenario for what is likely to happen in the presidential campaign, right? And I'm trying to get this thing to do the presenter view, and there we go. Is that showing?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes.
So
I had that bars over Nebraska.
okay. I only wanted to show this one because when we started back in May, in my first presentation, we were looking at the contest for 2020 and how it looks in the Electoral College. The Electoral College math has changed substantially. So one of the points we were making today in response to some of the questions was that a lot can happen in the next 4 months. Be very cautious about predicting what is going to happen on Election Day, November 3rd, when we're several months out from the presidential election. And we don't know if there will be an October surprise. We don't know what the third quarter economic report is going to show. We don't know if there will be a vaccine. A lot of things can happen. And in a relatively short period of time between when we started, right, several weeks ago, and now to today, the Electoral College math has really shifted significantly. Here we have a scenario that shows that it's a very, very difficult campaign for Donald Trump because he has lost significant support in the polls in critical states in the Electoral College where he either was ahead several weeks ago in the polls or he was at least competitive. And so since 270 is the magic number, if the math today holds up on election day, Joe Biden has a very easy path to victory here, right? He only needs to pick up one of the competitive states or a single elector in each of the two states that split their Electoral College votes, right? Let's hope he doesn't pick up one and Trump wins everything else, because that's the other nightmare scenario, which is 269 to 269, which becomes a contingent election, the first since 1824, as Bill Schneider was pointing out before. That's the other scenario where you can have a contingent election. You have the perfect tie in the Electoral College. So looking at this map, for example, if Trump were to win all the swing states that I put in gold here, he would get 270. But if he lost one vote either in Nebraska or Maine, where they allow a split of the electors, we would end up with the perfect tie in this election. But again, I'm just pointing out here that I don't want to leave you with the impression based on my presentation back in May that the Electoral College math looks pretty good for Donald Trump, because it no longer does. And the fact that we've done this over a several weeks period of time, we have already seen ourselves just how significantly the political situation in the United States can change. The unrest, of course, over the police murder of George Floyd, which has just activated a mass movement in the United States that has caused protests to continue day after day after day, has had a profound impact on the electoral situation, and in part because President Trump really did not have a message that resonated with the American people that would calm the situation, bring people together. There were ways I think a president could have captured that moment and really ridden it to increase public support at a time when the country was calling for such leadership, but he decided yet again to revert to his typical approach, which was to engage in very divisive politics, right? Talking about when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and law and order, going back to the Nixon 68 message, of course, that we've talked about here. And for most of the public, people think it was absolutely the wrong message in this critical moment in our history, when something so significant, one of these great change moments in American history that Bill Schneider was talking about, is taking place right before us. He wasn't seen as the man of the moment in this particular case. So can he turn things around? It depends on a lot of circumstances, many of which we simply have no idea. So with that, I thank all of you. This has been a really interesting exercise, these several webinars that we have done over the past several weeks. I've learned quite a lot, and I hope you have too, and I hope this will be the beginning of a long collaboration where we can continue our discussions about American electoral politics and future election cycles. So thank you, everybody, and in Korea, have a good evening, and in the United States, Bill Schneider, have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.